So good afternoon or evening, wherever you are in the world right now. My name is Leslie, and this is the Gender Inclusivity panel that's part of the online Megagame Con, which is our wild attempt to bring a whole bunch of online megagames together over one weekend, and then also offer some panels and some thoughts around where megagames are at, and perhaps help impact some of the conversations that are happening around megagames, and maybe influence how those happen in the future when we are able to play together again in the future. That's our goal. And I'm so honored by the panelists who've joined today for this conversation. We're going to introduce ourselves in a little bit. Just wanted to remind us all to be really open-minded as we listen. Feel free to use the chat feature, share some thoughts and questions. And if you want us to actually answer questions, we're encouraging you to just post those into the Q&A feature, so that we can see those and answer those at certain points as we go. So we will try to make this as conversational for you as possible. And if you have an interest in continuing the conversation, we encourage you to join us throughout the con on the MGC Discord. So without further ado, does anybody want to introduce themselves first?
Yeah, I will.
Oh,
I'm just going to jump in right in. Yeah, I'm Becky Ladley. You might know me as Becky. I have been a Megagamer since 2014. Watch the Skies, the Shut Up and Sit Down video one, was my second ever Megagame, and I was the only woman at that game. So yeah, Megagames have come quite a long day in sort of the past 6 years. I believe I'm the first female Megagame designer as well. I've designed 2 games, Everybody Dies and Trope High. And I blog about Megagaming and immersive gaming and various other things over on Becky Blogs. So that's me.
Thank you, Becky. Okay. Matty, do you want to go?
Okay. My name is Matty. I'm based out of Reading Megagames. I started Megagaming in 2017, and I'm currently designing a game set in 19th century Japan with some alternative history and mythological elements. And I'm very passionate about, as a lot of us here, I think we're here because we love megagames and we want to expand megagames and bring more people into megagaming. And I think there's some progress, further progress, that needs to be made in terms of inclusivity and diversifying our player base and, our organization base and designers. And I want to help drive that forward, basically.
Thank you, Matty. Seumas, do you mind going next?
Sure, no problem. Seumas Bates. I've been involved with Megagames since 2015 or 16, probably 2016. And 2018, I was part of the founding committee for True North Megagames, which is a network in the northern part of England and Scotland. Last year, I designed and ran my first solo game, which was Kingdom of Seasons, an awful lot of fun. And yeah, I guess especially since the founding of True North, as Matty, similar to Matty, I've had a real interest in expanding the player base and diversifying what we offer as game designers and runners.
Stefan, do you mind going?
Yeah, of course. So I'm Stefan Salva Cruz. I designed Megagames here in New York under the Ironmark Games banner, but now more recently under the Magic Coffee House group that I've started. And the one Megagame that I created that has taken off at least a little bit in the US was The World Turned Upside Down, which was an American Revolution Megagame. And that game we toured across the country in various conventions. And, we did a lot of work to try and build out that game so that it was accessible to as many people as possible. So that's where I've been coming from in terms of the Megagame scene.
Yeah. So lastly, I'm Leslie Loy. I'm over at West Coast Mega Games in California, and have been sort of on the periphery initially of Mega Games from 2014 when Watch the Skies and the video came out, and then got involved much more in 2015, and so have been involved since then. I didn't realize that I was sort of uniquely positioned within WCM just to be on pretty equal footing, involved at the leadership role of helping to facilitate and run Mega Games, until I started becoming much more involved in the Mega Games scene in the US and realizing there were no other women involved, which I've joked about, going, where are the women? And more recently have gone, no, really, where are the women who are running games, and why am I not seeing them? We see a lot of them as players, but not taking on leadership roles and not engaging and sort of helping to facilitate more of that. And so that's definitely a question for me. So I'm very interested in hearing from one another and talking about that, and also talking about the things that we see in games. So Seumas, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, there was meant to be one additional member of our party, Josephine Vesburg from Gothenburg Mega Games in Sweden, but unfortunately she's not feeling well. And Josephine, if you're watching, rest up, take it easy, and hopefully you'll feel better tomorrow. We'll try and do you proud with our discussion in your absence. But yeah, so I'm afraid viewers, you're stuck with just the five of us.
So the conversation, I think, really just for us to start thinking about this a little bit more, and we've talked a little bit about this, is really the challenge of the presence, or sometimes lack thereof, of women and non-binary individuals in gaming, and why that phenomenon exists. And I know we all have thoughts on that, so maybe if you are ready to jump at the bit and share some thoughts, now would be a great time. And then sort of see, and just for the attendees, our intention is we're really going to have a conversation, and hopefully you find some interest in that, and you can also pose your questions as part of our conversation, sort of seeds for thought. So anyone want to jump in first with some thoughts on your experiences, that maybe speaking anecdotally about mega gaming and the role of, or what you've experienced?
Can I point the question at someone else and say, Becky, we were talking just before we started recording about how when you started mega gaming in the UK, you were the first or the only woman at a lot of games, and maybe talk a little bit about how that was starting out and how that changed and a bit there.
Yeah. So yeah. When I started mega gaming, it was just before the sort of shut up and sit down bubble happened. So it was still very much a niche hobby, and it was, you know, a few dozen, mostly men, who generally knew each other. And when I came along, my first game I was one of two women. My second game I was the only woman. And since then, there has been definitely an increase in sort of the number of people that have been coming along to games, and also just the sort of different places. So back then, the majority of the games were in London. There were occasional games up in Leeds, but sort of the geographical diversification, I think, has helped, because it's going to places where they've needed to, where the word has needed to be got out a bit more. Whereas back when it was just sort of the Mega Game Makers group in London, it was people telling people that they knew, and it wasn't the sort of drive to build a community in quite the same way. And they you know, they were building and they were inviting friends and people along, but it wasn't quite in the same way. And I think yeah, Shut Up and Sit Down, I think, has definitely done wonders for sort of getting quite a different demographic, just in terms of age. A lot of sort of younger people in their 20s and 30s have been coming along as well, and with them a lot more women have been coming along. So I think, yeah, it's definitely been a move towards having more women. But I think nowadays, even if you go to a mega game, chances are, you know, there are definitely still games going on where I go and I'm one of one or two women. So I don't think it's a problem that's in any way been completely fixed or cracked or anything.
still a long way to go, I think.
Do you have a sense of, and I wonder if it's a little bit different in the UK than the US, of, is it we've talked a little bit about whether it's the entry point or the appeal or the way that mega games are spoken about. So what is it that either compels people to show up, and then what is it in their experience that perhaps does not encourage them or invite them to come back, or is it just not their thing, which is always possible? But have you experienced anything in your mega gaming experience that perhaps would help you have insight into that?
Yeah, I think especially when I was well, mega games are really, really intense situations, and when you go along to a mega game, like, people are talking over each other all the time, people are butting in, and a lot of the time in a mega game, if you want to do your best, it's often beneficial for you to be really sort of forceful with it. And I do find that when I've had seen women at mega games or invited my friends along, and they'll be in a situation where they get spoken over or ignored, and if it's the sort of thing that they're dealing with in their day-to-day life, sort of personally and professionally, why would they want to encounter that in a hobby? And I think that is something that puts people off. And I think, you know, that's one way to play a mega game, and being sort of forceful is definitely a way that works at mega games. But I also think that there's more we can be doing to find roles for people who are good at other things, and also to encourage people to just be a little bit more thoughtful when they're doing that, and how much they're doing it, and if they are taking up too much of the talking time, as like if there's 10 people on a council. In mega game, you want to be talking 100% of the time to get your points across, but should you be as a person?
Yeah, and I think that really reflects the general sort of culture of the norms, as you were saying, Becky, about the norms of interactions around mega gaming, which simply do not have to be the way that they are. I mean, this is a particular culture which has evolved over years, and we find ourselves with this kind of preponderance of shouting, I guess, and just this kind of norm that you expect this is the way people are going to interact. But there's absolutely no reason why that has to be taken as the norm, and there's no reason why people should encourage that kind of interaction, I think. But I think that is still the case. That is still what people expect, and therefore what people try and emulate, or feel they have to emulate in some way. But there's no reason everyone couldn't just talk at a slightly more respectful volume and just get their point across in the same way.
And I think there's a similar thing with just thinking of mega games as having to be very combative and confrontational. And I think there's an assumption a lot that is what mega games are about. Mega games are about conflict and confrontation, and historically, yes, they have been, but I don't think that's the only way that mega games can be. And I think actually we can diversify the way we design games to appeal to a much broader range of people, rather than just a very narrow personality type that really engages and really enjoys with that kind of slightly more conflict-based play style.
In my experience, I think it comes also down a lot to, it comes down to design, but it comes down so much, we've talked about like facilitation. So the role that the controllers play in making sure that the voices are heard, or redirecting, or, you know, whatever it is. I think that there is a lot to be said for that. And that's an art, like that's an absolute art form, is figuring out how to do that and not interject yourself as a player, or with a subjective experience into the picture, which I think can be very challenging. And that also might be cultural. I don't know what it's like in other groups, but for us, we spend a lot of time training our controllers, and talking about those kinds of conflicts and how we navigate those pieces.
And this maybe is some more stuff that we could maybe do with control, is just normalizing the idea that it's okay for control. If you're having a conversation, a Wizard Wheeze, for example, with a quieter player, and a louder player comes up, often the control's attention gets pulled away by And I think we do need to sort of take the time with our control to normalize the fact that it's okay to tell that loud and brash player, you know, you can wait for 30 seconds. I'm going to finish this conversation first of all and then come to you, which doesn't always happen at games.
Yeah, and that's a issue that only gets more complicated online, right? Especially not being able to be in that room, and it's something that is incumbent on the game runners to establish, you know, what is a appropriate, you know, set of rules for conversation, engagement, role playing. You know, a lot of the LARP scene has already started to do so much of that work in terms of establishing their not only code of conduct, but, you know, rules for role playing to ensure that if someone does feel uncomfortable with the path that role playing is taking, or just the conversation is taking, that there are certain rules that and tools and techniques that folks can use to curb that. And I think that's something that you know, I've been taking a look at, and I think is worth trying to bring out at the forefront of your games to say, hey, you know, we're all trying to, you know, have fun pretending to be wizards or whatever, but also we want to make sure that you know that if you feel uncomfortable, you know, here are a set of tools and set of things that you can do to say, okay, I need to stop this conversation, or I need to move this conversation a bit more in another direction. So. Yeah.
Can I bring up one of the questions or comments from an attendee that I think might be really helpful to the conversation? So Matt is asking a little bit. He's saying that there's, you know, currently most mega games are formed sort of at their core. They have a conflict at their center. So how do you? I think the question sort of is he says more specifically, even in Trope High or It Belongs in a Museum, two games with less obvious conflict, they still remain. Competition for grades or for getting the best museum, so on and so on. How do we reduce the conflict in conflict-driven environments? And I think I would add on to that, and how does that contribute to that tension that we're speaking of more aggressive play styles and more aggressive strategies as opposed to perhaps subtle negotiations and alliance building? Thoughts on that?
I'm not sure we need to reduce the conflict. Sorry, Becky, on you go.
No, you go ahead.
Just that I don't think necessarily, well, Becky, you can, or Matty, you can correct me if I'm wrong, or Stefan, sorry. I don't think what the objective is necessarily to reduce conflict or to remove conflict from games. I think we could do with a few more collaborative games where all the players are working together towards a common objective. I think that would be a fun avenue to explore. But I actually don't think that necessarily the objective is to remove or even reduce conflict. I think it's the way that conflict is mediated and actually entered into by players, you know. And I think, as we were saying with control there a moment ago, certainly a control player would hopefully stop a player who was being, say, openly racist or openly misogynistic. And I'm sure all of our control, all the games we've run, a control player would shut that down immediately, hopefully. Perhaps we just need to consider where that particular line is drawn and whether we need to shift that back and forward a little bit and have control being more aware that particular play styles are railroading other players out of the way, and maybe have the control player just have a word with very, very brash and very, very outspoken players, that maybe they could just tone it down a little bit and allow other people to play the game as much as they are. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think there's anything that goes against the spirit of the game or the spirit of fun. As Johan of Gothenburg says, you know, your objective in the day is to have two other players have a good time. And I think that's the way he always starts his games. And I think that's an excellent way of starting your games. Sorry, Becky, I interrupted you.
That was exactly the point I was going to make. I was going to mention the make sure two other players have fun. And I think the more that we see a mega game as a collaborative experience, rather than a collaborative narrative story building game, than a competitive, like, we must win. And I think that giving people diverse aims, so that not everyone's going after the exact same things, so that even in the jaws of defeat you can snatch victory and all that in some small way. I think that just makes, like, focusing on the narrative and on, yeah, just so that all players can achieve something, even if it's not everything, will just make it easier for players not to be as ruthless in conflict situations.
But I think we're talking about like the very obvious aggressive behaviors that sometimes we see, and what I've experienced more frequently, both in games and I think sometimes in the mega game community, is the more subtle ways in which there's not an inclusive sort of welcoming environment. And I think that's probably, for many players and people who'd be really interested in being involved, even more off-putting than the aggressive player. Because in some ways you can handle the aggressive player and you're more likely to get support with the aggressive player. And it's the subtleties that are I think much more demoralizing for people. And that I think is also really difficult to spot, because then you're speaking really to the heart of a social issue, right? And how do you navigate that? And I think, it sounds like True North has really made some very conscious steps towards doing that. Perhaps organically here too, Kurt is asking a great question about casting and how that influences inclusivity. And if we have thoughts about what questions can be asked during the casting process to better suit the person to the role. And I know that there's some passionate probably responses in the group here to that. So maybe we can take that as a segue too.
I'm personally a really big fan of casting. I think casting questionnaires, which I think, Becky, you started out in the UK.
I don't know if I started. I definitely pushed for them. Yeah.
Yeah. I when I was running Den of Wolves in Switzerland, I basically took the casting questionnaire that Becky had made for Everybody Dies and just changed the title to Den of Wolves. So like massive props to Becky really for pushing that, because I think it helps a lot. I think I'm sure many of us could talk basically for a whole hour just about the benefits of casting questionnaires. But I really think asking players what kind of level of competitiveness they're looking for, whether they want to play more collaboratively or whether more competitively, and then also just the amount of role play that they're looking for, whether they want a more mechanics focused role. And if just looking at Den of Wolves as an example, because it's probably one that a lot of people here will know, even looking at Den of Wolves as someone who might know a little bit about mega games, without having played the game, you're not going to know, different ships have different play styles. And, if you want to be playing a more collaborative kind of game, there are ships that facilitate that. And if you want to play a more combative, aggressive, kind of stirring up trouble kind of a game, there are ships that facilitate that. And I think knowing what kind of way players want to play, you can place them in a ship where the brief fits the kind of game that player wants to play. And I think there's one of the things that I think Den of Wolves does really well is that it has space for both more collaborative styles of play and more competitive and more treacherous styles of play. And I don't think we necessarily want to be erasing conflict from mega games, but what I think we should be trying to do as designers and organizers and even as players is facilitating different areas of the games that have different levels of competitiveness or collaborativeness, so that there's areas where if a player does want to play a more collaborative game, there is an area for them to engage with. Because I think one of the issues that I think I kind of see in mega gaming is that if you have a more collaborative style personality and you want to be essentially getting along with people during the day, it's in a lot of ways quite hard to engage with mega gaming, because most games you have to be kind of shouty and kind of go getting out there. And I think it's a really big part of why Den of Wolves has done so well, is that it is in essence a very collaborative game. And I think it's a play style that I think is massively underserved at the moment in mega gaming.
I haven't gotten to experience Den of Wolves, so this all sounds wonderful to me. Can Can I also ask Becky and Matty, you both have run games, which I haven't, other than the logistics of games, right? And have you, when you've had that opportunity, what have sort of been the things at the forefront in putting on the logistics or the way that you're working with your controllers or however you guys work, that you've really said, this is something I really want to make sure that I'm doing towards creating a more inclusive environment? And I'm sure that Seumas and Stefan can speak to that too, but you guys are very unique in this way. There are not many women, as far as I know, who've done it, and I don't know of any in the US or in Canada who have, and I could be wrong on that front, but I'd be interested in hearing what you thought.
So I will interject first with the thing that one of the things that came out of the True North Symposium, which I was incredibly grateful for when we did the forum on gender inclusivity, was actually coming onto this call and having women there from Canada, from Australia, from Sweden, who had been involved in organizing games and going, oh my gosh, they do exist. We just don't see you. And that's, yeah, so they do exist, but I don't know why. I think, you know, we talk a lot about designers. We don't talk so much about organizers. And there are women who are kind of behind the scenes talking about new player issues and organizing issues, but they're not getting talked about, or they're not, you know, appearing on podcasts or things like that, because as a community we seem to talk a lot more about designers at the moment, and you know, apart from Becky, we're still pretty low on female designers. So I just wanted to say we do exist, but yeah, it's hard to find them, but yeah, they do exist, and that was for me really amazing to see. Yes, we do exist.
Yeah, it's a really long journey to writing a game. I mean, I started making a game in 2014. I put on my first game at the end of 2016, and I think that is quite quick, to be honest, to be entering the community and then putting on your first game. I know some people will do it quicker, but given that it's still very much an emerging hobby, people joining the hobby. I mean, some people might never want to design a game, and as you say, they're playing a really, really important part behind the scenes. But some of them might be on their way to running their first game. And, you know, I do think that in the coming years, we'll see like a huge swell of female and non-binary designers joining our ranks. Going back to Leslie's question about considerations to make it more inclusive, casting was definitely a really big part for me. But part of the reason that I designed Trope High is because, like, I don't want to be like stereotypical and stuff, but like, I love American high school shows. I'm sure there are lots of men out there who do, but I'm sure there are tons of women out there who do. So I partly designed it because I was like, this is an interest that I have, and I'm sure that there are plenty of other people out there who share this interest, and that interest is not being catered to in the megagaming community at the moment. So that's part of the reason why I just went completely out of the left field with that design, because, you know, it's something I'm interested in and I love megagaming. So if there are people out there who are like me, who have those two weird interlocking interests, then like that's why I want to do that game, and that's why I'm really sort of pushing for quite wacky game ideas. Like I really like things like Monsterville Mansion, things like It Belongs in a Museum, things like all those sort of more out of the box things like Owl League, the sort of more not historical, not like just the wacky games that will just get completely different people into the hobby.
Yeah, I'm totally on this train. Totally on the wacky left field themes train, for sure. Yeah.
You think those
actually,
are more
and I think in a lot of
approachable?
ways we shouldn't be calling them like left field wacky ideas. We should just be calling them other very great topics for mega games.
Yeah, very true.
Can I actually put a question to the other members of this committee, because it's something that came up after our run of Den of Wolves in Edinburgh, which was we sort of looked around the room, and none of the ships were captained by female players. the president was, but all of the other captains were male identifying players. And afterwards, I had a talk to the two guys that run it, and I was like, maybe we could have done something else there. And their response was that we put out casting questionnaires and we asked people to rank 1 to 5 how much they enjoyed different roles, creative, negotiation, leadership, and none of the women put leadership as their preference for a role. And so the designers, the runners were like, you know, we wanted to respect the players, what the players were asking. We tried to fit the players into the various places. And so we ended up having a bit of a discussion on the committee about how to balance offering a diverse range of players in a diverse set of roles versus what players' explicit preferences are when filling out a casting questionnaire. And in the end, we actually did come down on the side of the guys who run it, and was like, yeah, fair enough. If the players want to play these roles and not these roles, then fair enough. That's the way it goes. But I just wondered if you guys had similar experiences, or whether you'd come down on a different side of that particular discussion, because it really stumped us for quite a while.
So I have a couple of experiences that come to mind. Firstly, I completely agree with you. Player preference is what matters here. If you ask all the players what they want to be, and none of the women who are coming say they want to be in a team leader role, then don't put them in one, because that's just more likely to give them an experience that they don't want to have. I have had a couple of sort of weird casting experiences in the past. Sometimes when I explicitly asked to be a team leader and I didn't get a team leader role, and none of the team leader roles were women, and I was told later it was because none of the women had asked to be a team leader, and I was like, I did though. So that was less than comfortable. And I've also been told in the past that in sort of various settings, it's impossible to change the genders of certain characters, and I wanted to play a female character, even in scenarios where gender didn't matter, that if I wanted to play a female character, I could only go into a specific sort of role. And things like that, just, it's just not helping the community be more diverse, because it's especially, like, there's a whole, that, you know, we could get into a whole great big conversation about, you know, whether casting should be completely gender blind, and whether, you know, whether we should be switching the genders of historical characters and things like that. And that's a whole big discussion. But in terms of situations where you've got complete control over it and it's not a historical situation, it is definitely a choice to not want to change the genders of certain character types and stuff.
You guys ask for gender at the registration process, or for casting questionnaires?
It
Is that a
depends on
question,
if a game is has kind of named character roles and maybe historically based roles, and then there's roles are gendered, then the gender of the character that a player wants to play can be relevant, depending on the game.
Yeah, I've evolved on that over time. So in my first ever game, I didn't want to cross-cast players because I once had a really, really shitty experience with a male player who role-played a woman really, really insensitively. And since then, I've come to realise that was just one player, and I shouldn't be making decisions for my players since then. And ever since then, I've just been asking people, what gender character do you want to play? If it's in a game that matters. If it doesn't, I mean, in Trope High, it literally only mattered because I was picking names from like TV shows and I wanted to give them the right gender name for their character. But it literally didn't matter other than that. And then in Everybody Dies, there were differences between male and female roles.
Yeah, I think on casting, you know, women as leaders, if no one has asked for a leadership role, I think one thing that I would kind of flag here is that because of, you know, societal gender norms that exist, and, you know, different way, you know, girls and boys are taught about leadership and things like that, just statistically women are less likely to say that they want a leadership role, probably, even if actually maybe they would actually quite enjoy it or things like that. You know, there's lots of literature with data saying women apply less to promotions, even if they're just as qualified. You know, women who are as qualified don't apply for promotions that men who are less qualified than them apply for. You know, there's all sorts of things going on out there that influence this kind of thing. And I think in a situation where, you know, you're designing or running a game and you'd like to have sort of equal representation, or, you know, at least have a sort of ratio of leaders that reflects the ratio of female players, and no one actually says they want to be a leader, I'd potentially think about getting in touch with those women and saying, listen, we haven't had anyone asked to be leader, but we'd really like some women to be leaders. Would you be interested? You know, not saying we have to have women as leaders, but I think the idea that, you know, not everyone is going to start on an equal footing in terms of thinking I can be a leader, or, you know, naturally puts themselves forward. I think that's something to be considered as well.
I also wonder whether if you asked, rather than would you like to be a team leader, like if you asked for specific skills, like are you good at coordinating things, or organizing things, or making decisions, or things like that, and you didn't put leader on it, but you just asked for those skills, whether you might get a different response.
Yeah,
The question that I tend to ask is, do you want to be in the center or on the periphery? Which I quite like as a question. And it allows, and I tend to, perhaps wrongly, but I assume players who like to be at the center of things are more likely to be comfortable in a high stakes leader role, where players on the periphery generally probably not. But what Matty was saying there, if you have a personal relationship with players, it absolutely helps. But of course, often you don't. And you don't know the players well enough to message them and be like, hey, you could do that role. What do you think? Unfortunately, but anyway,
I really like the way maybe phrasing it as more, you know, would you like to support a team, or would you like to support, you know, a team of new players, or, you know, things like that. I think there's definitely ways you could phrase it that's you know, coordination, things like that. But I think there's definitely some potential there for sure.
Right.
Yeah, and I think in some ways it's also just a matter of, you know, if for certain game designs, does a hard and fast like leadership role even need to be defined, as opposed to just saying, well, we're a team, we're going to do things as a team, or we're going to, you know, not necessarily have to codify a hierarchy, right, of who's in charge for things. You know, for a lot of the world turned upside down, since it's American Revolution, you know, we're covering all the different colonies, and we could have had governors and things of that nature for each of the colonies and set up that kind of government structure. But in a lot of ways that just wasn't important to us. The only like super hierarchical like leadership role that was available was the crown, you know, the ruler of England. And for that first experience, I actually had, you know, one of my friends, you know, who is a woman, expressed interest in being the head of England. So from the very beginning, it was not, we're not going to call them King George, right? They're not, you know, that's not what they wanted. We just started to refer to the entire system as the crown, or whoever is in charge in that area, right? So that continued to establish that that inclusivity of saying like, well, it doesn't have to necessarily be a man in charge in England, or it doesn't have to necessarily be a man who plays George Washington or any of the characters that we establish. It's really, you know, what you take into the role, and then it is your role after that.
But the thing is, do you actually need to change the name? And this is something that I've argued with people about in the past, is, you know, at the end of the day, you're not Alexander the Great, and you're
Right.
not George Washington, and you're not Elizabeth I, for that matter. So you are playing a character, whoever you are, whatever your gender identity is. So
Absolutely.
why am I more appropriate to play Alexander the Great than Becky, Matty, or Leslie? And why would we need to change Alexander the Great's name if Becky, Matty, or Leslie were cast in that role? I don't really understand why we would need. Why can't they just play Alexander the Great?
Absolutely.
So I think.
Yeah.
Sorry, Stefan. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to mention that it, you know, in a lot of ways, I played it both sides, right? If they wanted to refer to themselves as queen or king, then that's how I allowed them as a player to determine that, right? Even like you were saying, I think that was the key point is even though it was historically based mega game, we thought of all of the roles as characters, right? So you're not really, you know, no one's ever really George Washington except for George Washington, right? So it really is, you know, you're taking on that character and you're gonna perform it however you want. If you want to change that person's name because that's how you want to role play that character, that's up to you. But yeah.
I think the challenge is just overcoming the expectations and the norms of there's a mindset that we're working with here, right? That it's actually interesting to me. Somebody's in the chat just sort of saying here, well, somebody might not want to be called King George, without considering that historically there have been women who have been called king, you know, that exists as a precedent. And so for me, it strikes me more that there just is, it's a mindset. All these things we're talking about, like that women can't be aggressive or can't be competitive or shouldn't be leaders, these things, or that being historically accurate means being a particular thing. As we had the opportunity to take The World Turned Upside Down and brought it to high school 9th and 10th graders. And what struck me was just being able to say to them, hey, look, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to give you the opportunity to experience the challenges of being in this historical moment and what decisions you would make. So forget everything else you know, because if you're in this gaming experience, you don't know that, and just play into what's happening here right now, which is what we do all the time in our lives, and that's kind of what mega games are about. And somehow we sort of lose that. We get stuck in this way of thinking that being genderly sort of assigned according to whatever gender is somehow important. And I get that that's just that's something that is there, but I think that encouraging the narrative to shift in a different way is part of the opportunity that mega games are offering, right? For me, that's the exciting part. And I perhaps it's also because I haven't designed a mega game. I don't really play very many mega games, but I really think mega games are fascinating. So I'm not a social scientist, but I love to watch social dynamics, and there's some amazing interactions that happen between people in mega games, and that's what I think is great. And helping, and that's not everybody's draw to mega games, but I bring people there whenever they have those challenges inside themselves of, hey, look, you might learn a lot about yourself as a communicator by playing this game, or you might discover things about that historical moment that you thought you would do differently that you can't do differently because of X, Y, and Z. And so bringing it back to what to me is the fundamental point of a mega game. Like, why else are we doing this? You know,
questions,
degree, right? So anyways.
I mean, escapism, right? I mean, part of it is escapism.
So,
have fun. Have fun.
So why do we need to replicate?
To do that? And I think that's been incredibly challenging, and it's incredibly challenging if we're not equipped as facilitators or designers or even as players, because we've been briefed in the right way, I think, to participate and to know we have support to participate and to be free in that. And I think that's part of the cultural shift that interests me. And I think that I constantly come against is I just didn't know that wasn't out there to a large degree. And so knowing that, I actually find myself more on fire than I probably would be, because I want everybody to be able to experience this opportunity that mega games can give them that they're kind of missing out on because something else is in the way.
So I think I'd like to say something in response to Seumas's question of why just have the gendered, why not just have the original name that anyone can have, it doesn't matter. And I think my chief concern, where I think moving it to a sort of gender neutral name, I think kind of goes one step further, basically in I think kind of signaling, hey, we've really thought about trying to make this game inclusive, and it sort of signals, hey, we care about this issue. It's something that I've seen a few LARPs do, and I think it's something that I'm going to be putting into the game that I'm designing, where games explicitly say, listen, this is a historical game with an asterisk that there's no gender discrimination. In this game, anyone can be king, queen, whatever, there's none of that. And so you can come in and be a duke or whatever, you know, depending on the setting, and you don't need to worry about kind of sexism because we're being historically accurate, which is a thing that has happened and can happen, and I think something that really isn't fun to experience as a female, or, you know, maybe, you know, person of color, or, you know, non-binary player, to kind of face discrimination because of the role you're playing, and that is, you know, that people feel that they can do because they're in a historical setting. I think, you know, if a game wants to do that, it has to really signal that that's going to be something that is going to happen. And I think there needs to be a lot of careful thought about, okay, this is something that we're going to kind of have. And I think LARPs, the sense I get is that they do this really well, where there's kind of this really big range of, you know, really, really emotionally intense, challenging LARPs that really deal with complex issues. And then LARPs which say, you know, we want to be escapist, we want to just have a fun day. And you know what, for a lot of people, dealing with these kind of things is not going to be fun. So we're just removing that as a whole issue. And I think that's, yeah, I think there's at the moment we don't, I think enough about the kind of trade-offs that happen between historical accuracy and inclusivity, essentially. And I think signaling that we as a community care about these things by saying, okay, these are the things that we're not going to allow, these are the things that aren't okay, and playing a historical game doesn't allow this kind of behavior, I think is something that we can be better at.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think that, yeah, if you want to choose to include sexism in your game, if you're doing a historical game, and it is a choice because you're the designer, you have complete choice over what to include in your game. You're not modeling like historical sewage systems or anything like that. You're not, you know, you're not modeling that in your game. You're choosing not to model that. You can choose not to model sexism in it. And if you are choosing to, you should be treating that with the weight that it deserves. And you should make sure that the recipients of that sexism aren't exclusively the people who'll be experiencing it in real life. You should make sure in that game there is plenty of cross-casting, so that if you want to do that, both men and women are on the receiving end. Yeah.
And casting the perpetrators, the most likely perpetrators, or the people with what do you call them? Character sheets, which say that you are a sexist, are cast to people who can deal with that responsibly.
Yeah.
That part is it absolutely is one of the trickiest things too. You know, in a similar vein, like a lot of the world turned upside down doesn't, you know, we purposely say we don't want to engage with, you know, the racist aspects of that time period, because that's not, you know, to your point, Becky, that wasn't the purpose of the way we designed the game, and also not, you know, it would already establish exclusivity, you know, way ahead of even starting the game. So it's something that, you know, definitely needs to be considered. To kind of go back to that point about how the game is presented to folks, you know, something we see a lot in like board games is with rule books, right? Where that's one of the first engagement points for players is, you know, gendered titles for examples, or even just in the basic rule books themselves. That's something that is like super subtle, but also something that, you know, really should be taken into consideration when you're defining, you know, defining how you're setting your examples, or even like the titles of roles and things like that. So that's kind of where the idea of saying we're going to define this role as the crown came. And also like for the Owl League, initially we had defined this one leadership role with like an, you know, we wanted to give it that kind of fantasy setting of like a lord or a lady, but then we also realized that that also wasn't necessarily exclusive, or that was exclusive by defining it that way. So we actually determined that liege would be an appropriate non-binary term. So we said that whoever plays this role can be defined as a liege. They can have lord or lady as their moniker ahead of time. And that's, you know, just a subtle, very small thing that doesn't necessarily have mechanical effects, but it affects how the players feel about their roles, you know, when they play.
Yeah. Another thing that I'd sort of want to say on this is my experience designing Everybody Dies, I don't think I did that from a gender perspective perfectly, not by a long shot. There is a lot more I could have done up front to signal that sexism was a thing within the game world. I think I just assumed because it was a Game of Thrones game that people would be familiar with the setting, and they would assume it was. You know, as a designer, I absolutely had the responsibility to make sure that was more upfront ahead of time. I don't think I did enough cross casting. There was some, so I'm not saying that I've done all the things that I'm saying that people should be doing. And you know, if you've designed games in the past that haven't, you know, that haven't done their best, then, you know, I definitely haven't always done enough. But it's just about learning from people's experiences and listening and working out, you know, what sort of things are possibly alienating female players, possibly putting them off from coming to future games, and or stopping them from joining the community in the first place.
Taking feedback, right? I mean, that's something, you know,
Yeah.
often when we do game, you know, play tests and so on, or put rule books out to people to proofread, we spend a lot of time assessing mechanics or assessing, you know, lore or that sort of thing, and building worlds and so on. But seldom do we encourage people to read it with an inclusivity lens, as it were. Seldom is that our priority, you know, in the final months of a game design, when you're trying to write all the rule books and so on. You know, sometimes that's, or often it seems that is what gets dropped, in favor of tightening up mechanics or writing more backstory or 1,000 other things, you know. And I think we need to be more mindful as networks and as designers that lens doesn't get dropped and gets put back front and center.
Yeah, and I think too that it's sometimes difficult on paper to see what the tone of something really is. So figure, you know, where do these different sort of experiences really start to emerge? And it comes through how people interpret the rules and how the space is held and how things are sort of moderated. There's all these pieces that play into that. So I think that's definitely the first step, and it's a critical step, but it's also the subtlety of how you language the description of your game. It's who you reach out to. There's all these things that play into this eventual experience, and so I think that's also part of it, and that's a challenge right there. How do you market so that it feels inclusive and it feels attractive to people who otherwise might not even consider playing a mega game, let alone being somebody who's not sure that they can keep up because of whatever their perception is? I mean, they are real serious challenges, and we see them from lots of different angles, and so I think that's also part of it. And that's just ongoing work. And I mean, Becky, you're just alluding to the fact that things have progressed already so much in 5 years, and there is lots of work to be done. And I think it's conversations like this and having ongoing conversations like this, pointing things out where it's like, can we find another way to language that? That doesn't take away what you're saying, but that creates more opportunities for more voices and more roles or more perspectives to really be included. So,
and also perma banning sexists.
For sure.
Just like
no tolerance.
You know, zero tolerance. And I think networks, you know, I think we can work together better as networks about identifying very problematic players and just frankly banning them from the hobby. And I think that's something we can work more towards as networks.
Which
I think
really
just
interesting. And go ahead, Patty. Sorry.
Just with, I think, making code of conducts more prominent and then really sort of giving them a bit of teeth. I think, and really signaling these are behaviors that aren't acceptable, and really making sure that players understand that you come to us with this kind of a problem, we will do something about it.
Yeah.
Right.
I know that.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say that. Well, I think what's interesting about the now being all online, there's an interesting opportunity for people who are sort of a one-time or repeat offender to kind of now go to other games. And so, as a network of mega game communities, we have a responsibility to some way to figure out how to communicate these things, or to check in if there's a problem player or there's a challenge. Like, how do we talk about those things? And how do we facilitate that? And I know we've even had that in North America with, you know, we had a couple players who were coming from other groups to Gen Con, and we were alerted and we had to work with that. And so those are real issues. But virtually now we're in a very interesting time to try to figure out how we set that expectation, and while also still being individual groups.
Yeah, and especially like code of conducts are one of those first rules that you can give to, or one of the first tools you can give to your control team, right? So probably a good segue into that third topic, right, of how do you support control, right, is one, you give them the rule sets and the, like, you know, the ability to you know, see a problem and be able to handle it if necessary, you know what I mean? And that being a part of it, not just like the rules of the game, but also just, you know, standard social rules, just trying to establish a good environment to continue play in. So.
Yeah, it strikes me as it can be very difficult to moderate those things. And so also I think figuring out how to speak to, and I think some of us have had this experience of how to speak to an issue, but also not be aggressive, but be firm and clear. So that there's just an understanding. If somebody comes to you with an issue, to listen. That's what we do. That's what we do as game players, because at the end of the day, we're passionate about what we're experiencing, but it's it's also a game, and you have to be very careful about just, I think, moderating that, like, that there's a space we're in right now, and these are the rules, just as you would any game, and that I can't emphasize enough, I think, practicing just very objective, this is a no-go, and just so you know, we've had, whatever it looks like. So and helping everybody be really comfortable in doing that too, which is just a huge undertaking.
And that code of conduct is like a clear signal in both ways.
Yeah.
One is to tell the players that, a certain level of action or being overly aggressive in some way in these sets of ways is not good. It signals to those players, but it also signals to players who may feel uncomfortable in these situations that it's like, okay, well, there are things here that allow me to go talk to control and say, hey, I feel uncomfortable about this situation, or it lets other players know that, like, okay, that was considered at some point, so I should be able to go to control and say, hey, I think I have a problem. It doesn't have to, they can express the problem at the level of intensity that they feel that it's at,
Also other players, right? It doesn't just have to be the person who's suffering, which does that. A general understanding about decorum means that perhaps, especially if it's a new player who might think this is somehow normal, a veteran player might notice something, go to control and say, look, this is happening over there. Maybe you want to, go and deal with that. And I think veteran players especially should take a lot more responsibility for that sort of thing, being aware about this is not how, this interaction is not appropriate that they're witnessing. I should take the initiative myself and go and speak to control and say, look, this has happened. Perhaps you want to deal with that. Leslie, do you want to take some? I'm conscious that we're at 10 here in the UK, 5:05 with you. Do you want to take? Should we take some questions from?
Yeah, we have some fantastic questions, and there was also some great contributions in the chat, and I've tried to make references to them. Thank you, everybody, for really contributing, but I think it'd be a great time to look at those questions, and maybe we can sort of see who we want to direct those to as we go.
So folks, if you wouldn't mind posting, if you do have any some questions perhaps that we haven't answered, which are now lost somewhere in the chat, if you wouldn't mind posting them into the Q&A section, I'm going to read out a few, and then people can sort of come in. We've got one from Kurt here, which has sort of been answered, but I think it's good to talk about it explicitly, given that online games look like they're going to be with us for the future. How has or can the current shift to online impacted inclusivity? I think that's a great question.
I've got a couple of thoughts. So this is a bit out of the left field. Basically, a lot of people can't necessarily travel overnight to go to games, and I think that's especially the case if they've got families. I don't, but it might happen in the next few years. And Tim and I have already started talking about, oh my God, we're not going to be able to go to as many mega games because, traveling down to London for an entire weekend. And let's not pretend that it's not women that often fall mostly responsible for childcare duties. So I think that online games where you don't have to travel anywhere but can still take part in a mega game, and maybe you need to get some childcare for a few hours, will definitely encourage sort of women with young children, or men with young children as well, but to be able to attend more games. So I think that can't be underestimated.
Yeah, it certainly can't be underestimated just how accessible games are now, which is really fantastic. And I know that for us, we've seen just way more people become suddenly really interested in mega games and in what's happening and asking design related questions in our Discord servers. And so it's changing the landscape in that way. And that, I think that's been changing for a little while, but I love the idea of the games being way more accessible. and I think there's a responsibility that comes with that of, again, I think the way that we work together on communicating with people.
I think like a lot of things, there's opportunities and there's challenges. So I think there's opportunities that Becky's talked about. I've heard some really amazing stuff happen from some of the Den of Wolves games, with people being able to attend the game for the first time in their kind of identified gender in a way that they haven't been able to experiment with previously. Some really, really amazing stuff. So I think there's really a lot of opportunities there. Also just in terms of accessibility, you know, for people also with disabilities, where maybe just standing up a whole day is just not really something that you can do, and things like that. There's lots of opportunities. I think it also comes with challenges in terms of similarity. You know, we've talked a little about, you know, moderating interactions and the way, you know, interaction can be very gendered. And I think how that can be in some ways harder online, where you're not dealing with facial cues and things like that. So I think there's some challenges there, but yeah, I think like a lot of things, there's pros and cons, and yeah, opportunities and challenges, I would say.
You know, weirdly enough, on something Becky said just at the beginning there, one of the venues that True North uses is a church hall that actually has like a nursery connected to it, and like it wasn't intentional that was connected, but people have brought their kids.
Oh, trust me, when I have children, there will be definitely be like Megagame crashes. Yeah,
and you know what, it worked. People brought small children, and they loved waving at the aliens when they were coming by in their costumes. It was good. I've got a question. Sorry, it's coming up on my screen as anonymous attendee, so I'm afraid I can't credit you with it. But there's a question here about, I would love to hear some of the most successful examples of language panelists are using to lay a foundation for inclusive games. And perhaps we can expand that out to like just some great examples, perhaps from our experiences, of great ways of that people can be inclusive, you know, going forward, people who are watching this who maybe want to incorporate some good stuff into their games, but within language, within whatever, just some great positive examples.
So there's one that sorry Becky.
No, go.
There's one I really liked, which actually is attributable to Seumas, of when you were doing Kingdom of Seasons, your religious players were not called priest or priestess, they were called theists, I believe.
They were.
Yes. And I really like that. I'm gonna steal it myself for my own game. And it's, you know, something Stefan you mentioned with, you know, using a completely non-gender term, liege, for Owl League. I think that using that kind of language helps a lot, because it then lets the player choose how, you know, how they want to, what kind of role or gender they want to play that role in, but also really very obviously signals there's no difference between playing a priest or a priestess or a king and a queen, because the game name is the same.
Yeah, actually one of the best examples of this that I saw was at this con, and it was yesterday's playtest of As Thou Commands, which included an entire tonal guide, which laid out very explicitly, but this was by Peter Nixon, laid out really explicitly what was and wasn't acceptable in universe in terms of how you know, it said, you know, sexism isn't a thing. It said, you know, religion is a thing, but you know, don't use a word stronger than heathen. You know, players aren't evil. Players are, you know, like it was, I think it was about 3 pages long, and it just laid out what was and wasn't acceptable, on top of a whole load of other sort of rules, things like X card and asking for preferred pronouns and everything like that, just right from the start, that just made you see that it was a game that had inclusivity just sort of formulated right from the very start of the game. And that was that. I think that's one of the first. I think Kingdom of Seasons is another really good example of a game that did that really well. But I think As Thou Commands, you could just tell right from the sort of very beginning, it had this in mind, and it was really cool to see.
Can I say one thing to that? Because I think that the language and the rules is always really important. But one of the things that we have sort of by circumstance offered, and I know that other groups have started to do this, is that there's always somebody who's not a control and who's not a player who's there and who sort of can observe and give feedback too. So the tone and the language of the rules is the first step, I think. How the game is presented by the control team is another, and then just somebody who can give feedback and notice subtleties again is, I think, a really key part, because that tone, it has to be carried throughout, and how people can live with that when they're really trying to get their thing done it's a piece. And so, I'm encouraging more and more, I think, just to have somebody who's not attached to anything other than to be there to witness and to point things out if need be, who's comfortable going to control and saying, hey, I think, that there's something happening over here, because control is really embedded and involved in their games too, and they might not see things. And that's a really helpful tool that we use.
Yeah, and sensitivity readers, I think, is the key term there. And if you have the chance, or if you have someone who has that skill set, it's definitely something that you want to ask that person and say, hey, how, can you take a look at this? Is there anything problematic to that? In terms of growing your own ability to see things, I think also a lot of the indie RPG scene has been already doing a lot of research and doing a lot of thinking on it. So looking for RPGs that, talk about having sensitivity readers, or talking about fundamentally changing, what had often been terms that we now see have certain issues, like D&D's access on player race and things like that. Those are places that you can start to take a look at also, not just obviously in the mega game space, but just games in general, right?
Something which True North is going to be strongly encouraging our designers or people running games with us to be doing in the future, and this has come from suggestions from a few of our players, is that we're going to be encouraging designers to provide pronoun badges for players who want to use them and perhaps didn't bring one themselves. And this has come from some of our players who have been misgendered in the flurry of negotiations and the speed that mega games happen. And yeah, we're hoping that providing that may be a way of reducing misgendering of some of our players in the future. Something, obviously it's an extra expense for designers to purchase as part of running the game, but we're hoping it's going to be a valuable asset or something to add to future games. So yeah, we're going to trial that this year and see if it helps for that.
And that's doable on online spaces too. With Discord, you can set up bots that will allow people to tag their own pronouns as well. So that just helps facilitate that process. Yeah.
Any more questions from the audience? Anyone else got any? Or perhaps you disagree with something which has been said and you'd like us to respond. I mean, that's valid. I mean, by all means.
I think there's a really interesting one from Alex Beck here that I think might be interesting to cover.
Which one's that?
Is there anything game organizers and groups can do to encourage and support designers from more diverse backgrounds? And I'd say my take on that is that we need to get better essentially at stopping the pipes in the leaks in the pipes of going from starting out in mega games and sticking around long enough to want to design a game. I I think there's I think a very leaky pipeline when it comes to I think retention, and particularly of I think, you know, bringing more diversity in, and I think if we get better at plugging those gaps, then more diverse designers will follow, is my 2 cents on that question.
And especially perhaps plugging that gap between moving from a player to a control, which I think is still a problem. We've got a question here about marketing. How can we change marketing to be more friendly to women and BAME? Is that correct? People of color, to get past the problem that a lot of the geek hobbies have, where these groups are underrepresented and the hobby itself is viewed, often rightly, by current members only, as male one. Yeah, so how do we deal with marketing to encourage more diversity in our games?
Well, I work in marketing, so I feel like I should probably answer this. So I think that's a really hard question to answer, because I feel like it would be really disingenuous to use a load of stock photos that show, or stage photos that show like a predominantly female group enjoying a game, and then for the like a couple of women to turn up and find that not happening. At the same time, I do feel like if I hadn't turned up to the Shut Up and Sit Down, Watch the Skies, and there had been no women in that video, it would be a lot harder to get women into the hobby. So having women in publicity photos and people of colour in publicity photos is, I would say, absolutely essential. But it is really hard if you don't have those people there, or if they don't want to be photographed or photographed for publicity. So talking to people, checking that it's okay to take photos of them, and that to use them in publicity photos. I mean, at Trope Pie, I hired a photographer to get some really cool photos because I knew I was going to have a high female turnout at that game. So I was like, let's get some really professionally done photos that, you know, we can use. You know, to be honest, if anyone in the hobby wants, I mean, they're weird and bright orange because the school colours were bright orange, but if anyone wants to use my photos, just drop me a message. I do like credit, but just drop me a message to ask if you can use them. Just marketing what mega games are. And what I used to do was literally every single time I saw someone taking a photo at a mega game, I'd like just run up to a map and point at a thing, so there'd be a woman in like most of the photos at a mega game, because I do not mind being used for publicity purposes. But it is hard if you don't have someone as center of attention grabby as me, to do it in a legitimate way that doesn't feel cheap.
Perhaps on that, we've got a question from Kurt here, which I have very strong opinions on in terms of my answer, but I'm going to put it to you guys instead. Do designers and organizers have a responsibility to help society move forward on inclusivity? And anyone like to?
I think we have the opportunity for it. There's a difference. And again, I think it's in the same way that it's easy for us to think that we know what happened historically and we would do this differently, that there's an incredible opportunity to experience other people's realities because of the way that a role is designed, and to perhaps develop empathy in that way and still have a really great game experience that doesn't have to be lost, right? I think with all things that have some role play element, there's that piece. So it's an extraordinary opportunity, and I would love to see more people take it up, but I also am not a game designer, so I'm a little bit of a hypocrite here.
But I think that puts the nail on the head in a lot of ways, in that there are gameplay allows for that ability to engage in a way, you know, especially role playing, right, in a way that you're not necessarily that's not your normal life experience, and giving people the ability to do that is really powerful. The other side, the double-edged sword of that is kind of making sure that as a designer, you have enough of the experience, or even the the ability to provide that experience responsibly, right? There's a lot of tricky things in terms of wanting to engage in that sort of play, but also I think on a more basic level, just understanding where your own personal subtle biases might be affecting your game, and how that might affect how other people see that, because that just ends up being a snowball effect. And that's I think just a struggle that designers should be having all the time. They should always be questioning their own personal designs to make sure that did I put in something that created a system that just inherently established a bias, or established some sort of exclusivity, even if that wasn't your purpose. It certainly should be something that you should be taking into criticism going forward.
Yeah, I personally have learned so much from Megagaming. Like, I never used to be particularly into history, but historical games have taught me a lot. But it's not just historical games. I've learned a lot about how people operate, and about how communities work, about how like political systems work, and everything like that. And I do think, as I mentioned earlier, regarding if you choose to include sexism in the game, that's a choice. Another reason why we do mega games is to learn and to explore scenarios. And I do think that there's an opportunity in there, and I don't know, it would need the right sort of designers to do it, but to teach about, the history of feminism and why it's necessary, and let people, I don't want to say let people experience it, but like there could be something there. I don't know, I'm just...
Well, that actually, Leslie, if we want to go into what you've suggested to be our final topic, and actually just bringing in a final question here to maybe bring us into the end of our discussion, Leslie, if that's okay with you. And just on what Becky was saying there, we've got a question from Andrew. What are your thoughts about the hobby move away from more traditional war games to more creative and role play driven? Oh my God, it's jumped. Driven mega games in regards to gender, race, inclusivity. And that, I think, links into both what Becky was just saying a moment ago just there, and also the final sort of topic of our general discussion about what is the future, what comes next, and how do we move on. All right, I guess a different question is, like, what is mega gaming going to look like in 5 years' time or 10 years' time? How is mega gaming going to have changed, or how would we like mega gaming to look in 5 or 10 years? Is perhaps a different question.
Becky's done a great talk on this at True North Symposium, which has that been recorded? Yeah, that was a really good talk, and I think basically predicted the future.
Available on YouTube, True North YouTube.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed, it's true. Well, but again, like it was a great talk, and I think it's a great thing to think about. Where would we like mega gaming to be in 5 or 10 years?
I think we should be running all these sorts of games. I think we should be running, but I don't think that the traditional war games is going to go away, because I think they're going to be people still interested in. Hopefully those games will become more, will fall into less of the situations that can be alienating to women, and but also at the same time that we have other games that are developed that will just generally appeal to a broader community, more women, more people from different races, more people from different countries, different ages. Like, I hate to say that there could be a mega game for everyone in the world, but you never know.
I think the idea of just finding ways to make them so they're just not daunting to people would be, I think, the real challenge because if you're running a really great game, and if you've written a really great game with clarity, somebody can step into it, and as long as they have guidance and somebody who can answer their questions, they should be able to find their niche, right? And I think that's is really designing in such a way that any kind of player has a space. And so if you're more of a role player, you can do that. If you're more of a strategist, you can do that. And playing more to those as opposed to words like leader, which have a lot of baggage to them. There's just rethinking some of the language, but also just rethinking the piece, the way that we present it. And I think that comes down to thinking about who do you want to have there, and you kind of have to think about the different people in your life and think about, well, what would it take for that person to show up? Like, what would I have to write for that person? Or if the game is a game that was written by somebody else, how can I make this attractive to that person?
That is an excellent thought experiment, Leslie. It never occurred to me to do that, but that sounds really good. Like, I think, yeah, I might do that. That sounds great.
Excellent. Let me know how it goes.
I love that idea. It's brilliant.
What would it take for somebody who's really bad with rules to show up, for example, right? Because that's daunting. That's why a lot of people don't play games in general. They're afraid that they're not going to be good at it, as opposed to thinking about the skills that they have to bring. So.
Yeah, and I think to what you were alluding to earlier too, like the idea that like I think also tying strategy to war or combat or death kind of has always been, one and the same, and I don't think that necessarily needs to happen or even be there necessarily, right? Like a lot of mega games have a sort of combat system or some sort of military system, just based on where it came from, but I don't necessarily think that it needs to be, it's not a requirement, I don't think, for mega gaming. So
I'm doing a talk about exactly that tomorrow, so I really hope it's not a requirement.
Yeah, so I think that's 100% something to be considering for the future, for sure.
Yeah, but I don't think I don't think every mega game has to be everything to everyone. I just think there need to be enough mega games out there that if you are looking for a game like this, there should be a game like that.
And look, I mean, just from a mercenary point of view, if you're a designer, like the market is clogged full of games about war. If you can do a good game about something that's not war, you're going to sell out your game. I mean, just like from a purely selfish point of view, if that's what motivates you, write a different game. People will come.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, we are at time. I think that this is actually, these are the kinds of conversations we probably need to keep having no matter what. And I hope that people have colleagues either within their little groups, or if not, through the various more networked platforms that now exist, whether it's the Megagame Coalition or the Megagame Assembly, or even Megagame makers on their Facebook page. There's just a lot of activity, and I think this kind of fruitful conversation about really difficult topics is really important. So I want to thank all of you guys for showing up and being here. And I know for some of you it's getting rather late, so really appreciate your commitment to the space and to the conversation. And for those who want to also continue within the con, there's of course the pub times, so 5:30 Eastern time, so in 3 hours, there will be the opportunity to continue this conversation. And I think just in chat throughout, don't let the ideas vanish, but continue to find a way to carry those forward would be great. And for people who have unanswered questions, I think bring those also to places where we can answer them, or other people can answer them, because we're not necessarily the only people who can answer them by any means. So don't let your curiosity stop here, please. Thank you again, everybody. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you for organizing.
Thanks for hosting it. Yeah.
Sure. Right. Have a good night.
Thanks.
Good night.
Thanks
Bye.
all.
Right.